Hello, in this lecture we are going to look at a very strong feature of the global aviation sector, which is its resilience. So, before we look at resilience, we need to know what is meant by a shock event, or SE for short. A shock event is any unexpected or unpredictable event which will affect an economy. Now, this effect could be either positive or negative, but usually when we use the word shock event, we are more concerned with the negative effect on the economy of any unexpected or unpredictable event. These changes are because of changes in the exogenous factors. We are not looking at shock event as an event that happens because of changes within the air transportation sector. It's an external effect. This cannot be explained by an economic model. It cannot be predicted, it cannot be forecast, it cannot be estimated or known in advance. It influences the endogenous economic variables, although the factors are exogenous. So, question is, why do we want to study the past shock events? How does it help us as students of global aviation or air transportation? How does the study of shock events help us? Each shock event actually teaches us some lesson or a few lessons. From those lessons, we can plan the sector more efficiently so that the future shock events will lead to no or minimum damage. Shock events helps us to react better. The study of shock events helps us to react better if a similar thing happens in the future. The major questions to be answered when we study a shock event are as follows. One is, what are the elements on each of the shock events that led to the shock event, and how much time was taken by the global aviation sector to recover from each shock event? These are the two important things. What elements were present that led to the shock event, and how much time was taken for us to recover from them. Here is a list of a few shock events that took place in the global economy, and their effect we will study one by one. So, going back to 1968, there were two shock events. There was a Middle East war in 1967 with the repercussion felt next year, and in the UK there was a foot-mouth epidemic. In 1974, there was a major oil crisis. It was there previous year in 1973, and its economic repercussions were felt for the next 2 years and maybe for a few more years. This was a huge shock event for aviation. People suddenly woke up to the fact that the oil producing countries can take the entire world, at ransom. The 1979 was another oil crisis that took place. In 85, there were multiple terrorist attacks, and we woke up to the reality that terrorist attacks can really lead to a shock event to aviation. In 1991, there was a Gulf War which led to the oil crisis because the oil producing countries were involved in that, and there was UK economic reforms. Then in 2000, there was a dot-com bust, and that dot-com bust led to a large reduction in the employment of IT professionals and also their movements on business or other technical and commercial support duties. Then in 2001, there was a major shock effect event in the US, which was the 9/11 attacks, and that really hit the industry very badly, but as we will see, we also recovered from it. 2003, there was the second Gulf War and the SARS in the Asian region. 2008, there was a general financial or global financial crisis. All economies actually tanked a lot in 2008. Then in 2009, we had the swine flu pandemic. 2010, there were volcanic eruptions in Ireland, and 2011, there were earthquake and tsunamis in Japan, and 2011, there was Brexit. All these events are external to the air transportation industry, but they caused a huge shock and it took some time to recover. Let us see some of the shock events that adversely affected civil aviation. Here is a graph that shows the trend in the global air passenger traffic from 1950 to 2010, and you will see that because of certain shocks such as the 1979 oil crisis, 9/11 global financial crisis, there are some blips in the global air traffic growth from 1950 to 2010. What is meant by PG? PG stands for passenger gap. Passenger gap, basically, you can see in this graph, you see in the center you see this line which shows the actual passengers in this light green color, and the red line shows the filtered traffic, which is the potential traffic. Okay. So, you can see that the passenger traffic is slowly growing, but then there are certain years when there is a gap. Okay. So, you can see here is a gap, this is also a gap. Gap essentially means a reduction in the passenger that are serviced by the air transportation sector, and these grey colored bands indicate the first year. So, 1974 oil crisis and 79 oil crisis, you can see there is a passenger gap. Then like that there are many other gaps which are there because of the various crises. We will look at it one by one now. Some observations from this particular graph. The fall due to the oil crisis was the lowest but lasted the longest. You can see when the oil crisis led to the passenger gap, it continued to reduce the global air traffic, and then the recovery took place only back to the normal only in so many years. Okay. It was a negative passenger gap till about 1985. So, from around 1979-76 to 1985, the passenger gap was negative. Right. Now, why did the effect remain for so long? Why we were not able to recover quickly? Because in 1980s we also had global recession. So, there was another shock event along with the oil crisis, which led to the continuation in the reduction of the passenger gap. Or the beginning of the Gulf War II resulted in a downturn again in 1990s. So, again you will see there is a gap here. So, during 2001 to 2000 around that time, there were two things that happened together. That is the reason why we had a passenger gap here. There was a dot-com burst, and then there was 9/11, and 2008 there was a global financial crisis. So, again there is a gap because of that. One of the major shock events that disturbed the global civil aviation, starting from the US, which is the largest market, were the 9/11 attacks that happened in 2001, where we all know that the Twin Towers were attacked and more than 3,000 people lost their lives. This attack, as we know, was the first use of aircraft as, or a hijacked aircraft as a weapon of mass destruction. So, what are the repercussions of 9/11 attacks? Okay. There were some permanent changes both in the infrastructure as well as in the psychology of the passengers. So, many passengers began avoiding air travel as a result of fear from the attack, because they were not sure whether it could be repeated by another group of terrorists. Then air travel became more time consuming and hassle, because lot of new checks and security investigations were involved. Passengers had to go through very detailed security checks at the airports. The densely populated areas of the world were suddenly at the danger of becoming easy targets, because when a terrorist group attacks a densely populated area, it leads to much larger damage which makes bigger news, and that is what they want. So the effect of 9/11, if you look at it from the numerical, there was a study done by Ito and Lee in 2005, and they said that there were some temporary effects and some permanent effects. And the temporary effect was that the revenue passenger kilometers which were flown, the travel demand reduced by 1/3, 31.3%. The airfares reduced by about 7%, that is the yields, and the airline revenue was lost by about 9.1 billion per annum. These effects, of course, the travel demand increased, so the permanent reduction was only 7.4%, but you can see that the yields reduced further. So the net long term effect was about 10.7 billion per annum loss to the airline industry. The next major shock event was the SARS, or the Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, 2003. This took place mainly in the Asia Pacific region, and there you can see there is a huge effect of that. Now interestingly, the largest number of cases were observed in China and Hong Kong, including the deaths also. The impact on them was of the order of around $14.8 billion. But interestingly, even in Canada and US, which are very far away, because of the spread, there was, so worldwide the number of people killed was 775, primarily in China and Hong Kong. But you can notice that more than Taiwan and Singapore, there were people killed in Canada, right? The final damage totally was about $33 billion, which was almost 0.1% of the global GDP of the whole world. The maximum damage of SARS 2003 was on the Chinese economy, huge damage. It cut the GDP by about 1 to 3%, and in Canada, we lost about 0.6% of its GDP because of these cases and deaths, right? US did not suffer directly. The number of cases were less, but it lost around 7 billion in terms of GDP. So 30% of the total economic loss because of SARS was taken by the aviation industry. The loss was also felt by other industries, but 30% of the loss was suffered by the aviation industry. Now it is interesting to note, why did China have so many cases? Because some people using air transportation flew from China and Hong Kong to Canada and US, and also in Europe, and before the bans could be brought into place, the damage was done. We had a global financial crisis in 2008 where economies of many nations tanked. The European airports during that time lost 3 years of growth, and the global financial crisis led to the loss in the demand, or very much lowered the demand for air freight, because if the economy is down, people are not going to produce many items, then who will ship them and who will send them? So why was the air freight affected? Because if you notice, these are the main shock events, and you can notice there was a jump. If you look at comparison of the global revenue passenger kilometers with the GDP of respective years, we see that the global RPKs, which are on the left hand side, show a percentage change, and the global GDP shows the change. And now you can notice that the changes in the RPKs are mirroring the changes in the GDP. So when the RPK increase, there is around 1.6 times increase in the GDP. But is it consistent? No, it is not consistent, except during shock events it is consistent, but shock events lead to a sudden change in the ratio. In all this, there is a very interesting point, that in 2008, when the global economic meltdown took place, the Middle East was not at all affected. In fact, you can see that there is a steady growth in the air traffic in the Middle East. Okay. All other economies, European, North American industry and Asia Pacific, all of them actually are in the negative, whereas the Middle East is in the positive. The next major shock event was the swine flu pandemic that took place in 2009. It was an early warning of a global pandemic that was going to come in the future, but it's a warning signs that we did not heed to, and because of that we faced consequences in the next major pandemic, which all of us are aware. Okay. So you will notice the impact of swine flu on global aviation was significant reduction in the air travel demand, and the finances of the airlines were strained because the operating costs increased drastically. Why? Because there was a need for sanitization between every 2 departures. There was a need to do temperature checks on the passengers and to weed out passengers who showed sign or suspected swine flu infection, providing masks to the passengers and the crew. Initially, it was the airline that was responsible to provide these items. So, because of all this, the operating costs increases, and travel advisories and restrictions were imposed, quarantines were imposed. So, when you reach a destination, you are supposed to be in a quarantine for a period of time. Many borders were closed, and also the airlines had to adapt. They had to constantly change, because regulations are changing constantly, and they had to quickly adapt to those. Some routes had to be suspended because they became no more profitable. Globally, we realized something. We realized the importance of international cooperation, especially in sharing the data and information regarding the various infections and pandemic. We also realized the importance of coordinating travel restrictions, and these crises or shock events led to a very heavy adaptation of digital technologies. For example, online bookings became very popular, then mobile check-ins also became very popular, and contactless processes. These are also things that came into being when we were facing this kind of infection. The volcanoes in Iceland are very much prone to eruptions, and there was a very major eruption in 2010 which led to a huge impact in the air traffic. This was the largest shutdown of air traffic since Second World War, because 19,000 flights had to be cancelled. Okay. Now that affected 30% of the global passenger traffic, or about 4,900 million available seat kilometers because of this one incident. The plume did not remain at one place. Slowly it spread across Europe. It affected travel in Germany, UK, France. So if you notice, the worldwide available seat kilometers as on one particular day, April 19, 2010, 4899 were affected by the closure. So 29% or so they were affected. Here is a picture that shows how much was the spread. So the red dot shows the location of the volcano, and these black patches indicate how far the plume had spread only in about 9 days time. So all that area which is in the black color was prone to a problem. Now this is what happened on 18th April. All the areas marked in red colored, the traffic had to be closed. So pretty much the entire UK, pretty much entire Europe, except maybe Italy and a few other countries, they all had to shut down. So 1 week of ash plume in Europe led to such a large reduction. You can notice that 80% of the normal flights per day on one particular day had to be cancelled, and a large number of flights had to be cancelled. The left graph shows the percentage, which is the red dotted line, and the blue graph indicates the estimated daily revenue loss on the right hand side. So of the order of $450 million per day on one particular day, 18th of April. April is a time when people travel a lot in the Europe on holidays, and that is the time when it took place. So this is just 1 week, and look at the major effect of that. Here is the data regarding the airline, passenger and revenue impact per day. Total impact was 1249083. And if you look at the revenues, the total impact was $418 million. You can see the largest was in United Kingdom, which is $25 million approximately, which comprises total of 8%. But other routes also are 67%. So the effect on the European airline industry, so you can see that the proportion of the affected operations was much higher in Europe compared to all other countries, and you can see that the largest effect of the reduction in the ASKs or the available seat kilometers was in Europe. There have also been some tsunamis and typhoons, mostly in the areas surrounding Japan and those areas, which have affected. This is a tsunami at Sendai airport in 2011. You can notice the whole airport is full of water, and there is so much of damage to various parts and the components, and all the adjoining areas are submerged. So the aviation markets which are associated with Japan are as follows. Domestic is the largest, 82 million passengers, and then you have US, China, Korea, three main markets around 9 to 8%, and then you have Hong Kong, Thailand, France, Germany. Total 134.8 million passengers. The total revenue of these markets is around 62,479 million US dollars. Now you can see that how the revenues were affected. 100% of Japanese domestic travel market was gone because flights were completely closed down, and even the flights up to UK, Australia, Germany, because these are the markets which are served by Japanese airlines, they were also affected. So the exposure of an event that takes place in Japan is felt as far as UK, Germany, Australia, US. This particular incident led to creation of guidelines for tsunami preparedness and risk mitigation. Some barriers and defenses were created so that if you construct these barriers and the airports, you will have less danger of the tsunami flooding the airport. The infrastructure had to be elevated so that you can raise the critical airport infrastructure above the potential inundation levels, and early warning systems were implemented so that we get much advanced warning of the incoming tsunamis. Okay. Now this one alerts are meant for whom? They are meant for the authorities, they are meant for the people, and they are also meant for the nearby communities. Now typhoon JB and Mangkhut in September 2018, you can see this happened on September 4th from Osaka to Kyoto, and Mangkhut happened in Philippines to China. So this whole area was inundated. Lot of airports were affected, and resumption of traffic could only take place on 21st September at KAX airport in Japan, and 1,400 flights had to be cancelled in Philippines. Looking at the numbers, these are only 0.3 or 0.2% of the global activity, but they are financially huge effect. Now we come to the biggest shock event of the last few years, which is COVID-19. We all know about COVID-19. We have all undergone a lot of measures, lockdowns, etc. So when the COVID-19 crisis hit air transport, the global aviation industry was one of the most affected industries because there were massive travel restrictions and there was a huge economic downturn that led to very much reduction in the demand for air travel. You can see the number of flights in 2019 are on the top, and you can see there is a huge dip from almost February onwards, okay, and the maximum dip was in the month of April. Slowly it recovered, but not much, not to the original level. This is the data from IATA, which is year-on-year data. So if you look at April and August, you will find in April there was a 90% drop in the passenger demand of aviation globally. It recovered slightly, but still 75% was less in August. 30% freight demand. Now freight did not go that much because people were wanting to send supplies by aircraft. So many of the transport aircrafts actually were used to send medicines, freight and relief material. So therefore the dip in the freight was not as high as dip in passenger traffic, just 30% and 12%. So, there were many challenges and uncertainties, both in the medium term. In the medium term, the operating costs increased because of the health and safety measures, and it impacted both airlines and airports at the same time. There were social distancing measures which led to a 50% reduction in the passenger load factor, and the shape of recovery was very uncertain because it is influenced by many factors. Travel restrictions, some countries imposed complete travel restrictions, some had partial, some wanted to have quarantines, some had longer quarantines. Because of COVID-19, many industries had to temporarily shut down. There was reduced economic activity, and it changed the consumer behavior because people were really scared. So, the commercial air traffic was slow to recover, only 40% fewer flights were there. In the long term, there were changes in the consumer behavior because there were structural changes in the air transportation demand. There was permanent demand reduction because of model shifts. Many people realized that we could use video conferencing and online meetings to replace business travels, and it is still continuing. Even today, we have become used to many online meetings. Several meetings earlier which were in person are now online, and that reduces the demand for travel, including air travel. In many places, high-speed trains were introduced to replace the air travel. Then there were also many policy interventions. Now, aviation is often the target of policy intervention, and even more so in COVID-19. Governments intervened to protect employment in large air transport firms because otherwise they would have collapsed. The goals of these promotional schemes included promoting technology, innovation, safety and coordination among suppliers. Then there were many green industrial policies which are focused on low carbon aircraft. So, let us see how the government supported the aviation industry globally during COVID-19 crisis. In the US, which is the biggest market, $160 billion were spent by the government to support the airlines by August 2020. And if you see, the largest value is in the US and all countries, and we have just magnified it, and you see that $25–30 billion were spent by almost all countries. The forms of support were also varied. There were direct aid, there were wage subsidies, and there were sectoral schemes. Then also there were untargeted sectoral and firm specific measures, right. The debt level of the airlines increased a lot, 28% or so in 2020. This affected their investment and solvency. Many airlines started to send their aircrafts for storage. So, what is the learning for us from the COVID-19 for our sector? This particular pandemic highlighted the challenges such as liquidity, debt and uncertain prospects. It revealed the importance of air transport for peripheral areas to provide for distribution of vaccines, for sending relief supplies. Retail tariffs of air carriers for domestic routes were regulated and subsidized in some countries to allow airlines to take the shock. This is because of the public service obligations. Investments were promised, pledged or done to reduce carbon intensity and acquire fuel efficient aircraft. Now, what do we finally conclude? Is the aviation industry shock proof? What do we learn from the past shock events? Now, as per the data from IATA in 2018, we saw a demand of 6.4% increase with respect to 2017. Okay. So, it just went on, but then we had, so going back you can see that despite all these shock events, despite various global issues, the air transportation is growing and the trend is actually falling. So, it dips because of certain shock events, but it also recovers. Okay. So, what is the conclusion? The graph of growth always shows an uptrend. Should we assume that the aviation industry will always recover from any shock events? No, we cannot assume that because it depends upon the severity of the shock event. But the point is that the reasons for the resilient behavior of the industry are as follows. Global air traffic bounced back because of the fall in the real cost of air travel with time. In 50s to 70s, when the industry was developing exponentially during that time, technology leads to increase in the global traffic by 10% because the cost of air travel reduced by 5%. and also the improvement in the standard of living of the middle class also contributed a lot to this growth. So, in short, there are going to be shock events that have been in the past. The industry had seen a dip, but that industry so far has been able to recover. Unless there is a major shock event which is very difficult for us to recover, we do not know in the future. Nobody can predict the future. But it looks like, maybe it will take more time, but I think the industry will finally be able to emerge. But it needs support from the government, it needs development in the economy. Thank you so much.